Might just hit the live button.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Hi
It's
everyone.
Hangout is on now.
Hi, so my name is Gerald Rich. I recognize some of you folks down there. If we haven't met, I am an interactive producer with Vocativ. Main offices are out in New York, but I am out here in San Francisco, part of the wonderful Lonely Coders Club, and sometimes slacking with you guys. Before that, I was with the Marshall Project, and I'm here today to talk to you guys about a little awesome project I'm working on called Dataproofer. We just submitted it to the Knight Foundation to receive funding through the Knight Prototype Fund. So very much thank you to the Knight Foundation for helping us out with this. Basically, our idea is to make kind of a spell check for data. So I was going to sort of talk today a little bit about where that idea came from, and then really kind of open up the floor to you all, and like have a little conversation about smelly data, bad data, and data problems that you guys have run into. Because this is definitely kind of a tool that will be open source, and I really hope that you guys can contribute to it and possibly even get some use out of it. So I'm going to hop into this little presentation I did and screen share on that. Sorry for the never-ending repetitions of yourself. Okay, there we go. So I've worked at a lot of different places and interned at a lot of different places over the years, and one of the kind of interesting things that I've definitely noticed at some of these places is data and data problems. It's something that we talk about often, and I really sort of wanted to hit that nail on the head and think of a way that can kind of make sure that data is okay for use. When we think about reporting and using data, really it breaks down, I think, to about 3 steps: acquiring it, exploring it, and then reporting on it. When I say acquire, I think that can come from a number of different sources. Either it's in a PDF when we use something like Tabula to try and break it out. We can get it in a lovely mail form as a CD to us if it's a SQL export, or we just find it on internet, and that's always a fun, terrible place to find data sometimes. And that's often where data gets weird. It just sort of is not exactly what we'd expect it to be. You go and you find an awesome data source, and you're like, oh my god, this is exactly what I want. But as you're getting into the process, oftentimes I find in the exploratory phase of it, you start noticing more and more problems. And so that's to say that you might be doing some tests beforehand, but I find that more often than not, I start noticing other little things acting up when I take it either into Google Spreadsheets just to look it up, or in R, or in Python, and then eventually, even in the visualization phase of it, in D3 or any kind of other program that you might use, it's definitely where you start seeing outliers, missing values, and other kinds of wonky behavior. Where you want to say, oh shit. And I think really where this sort of came from is the fact that that's sort of not the best way of doing it. Oftentimes you need to then sit down with your reporter or some editor or something and say, hey, this is not exactly all that I thought it would be, or there might be something missing. Hopefully it doesn't get to that stage, but sometimes, under deadline and under pressure, that has happened before. And I think at all those places that it's definitely sort of, the data smells become more and more apparent as you really dive into it. So the goal of this was sort of to do something like spell check, wherein when you're reporting and you're writing a story, you have a little squiggly underline underneath it. Right now we are sort of in the very, very beginning stages of this prototype fund, and so what's really, really great is that we have sort of outlined the idea. We've outlined some GitHub issues for this, as well as identified about 15 different tests. Everything from, does this latitude and longitude make sense, to is there, an exact number of rows on the spreadsheet that sort of indicate that there might have been a SQL export error? Basically, sort of doing that, and then having some sort of similar situation where maybe there's, a two-column view where you look at your data and you just see cells that are having a missing column header, a value that is way too high, or a repeated row, or even just a URL that's just like not weird. Ultimately, similar to how spell check works, like we're not trying to stop you, nor are we trying to collect any data. This is all idea. The whole idea of this is that it's a desktop app that you drag and drop a spreadsheet into, and then you see what it's like locally, and then can decide where it needs to go from there. Does it need to have further reporting? Is it good to move on to a visual stage of things, or do you need to phone up the PIO or whoever you got the data from and ask some serious questions? But the goal of this is to not only sort of make this whole process a little more transparent for anyone who gets the data, and that could be a reporter, that could be you, that could be some editor or somebody, but also just sort of make sure that as soon as you get this data, you can kind of give it a quick once over and see what's there and what's not there. I'm going to sort of shift into discussion phase now, but I think sort of the general idea here is that this will be a good safety net for your low-level problems, but when we're talking about higher level stuff, case in point, a story that was using reports of Boko Haram kidnappings rather than actual kidnappings. It's harder to automate those kinds of things, but really in hopes is for you folk here, I think a lot of you are sort of way more experienced, and so the idea is sort of making sure that a lot of these tests gets executed, and you can kind of check those off your list and then start thinking more about higher level, thinking about the data source itself. Where does it come from? Does it actually represent the sample size which you're trying to get at here? So I'm just sort of going to open it up from there. Does anyone have any sort of questions or whatnot? And then I sort of wanted to talk about data problems that you guys have had. Hi.
Awesome, thank you. That was great. Well, so did you want to go over at all the ones that you guys have already identified, the 15 tests that you guys have already identified?
Sure.
Or kind of like summarize them or whatever?
Sure. So let me just pull up this right now. I've written about, say, a quarter of them. The idea of this is to do this in Node.js, and then we're going to wrap it up together an Electron app, and each of these are going to be individually documented, so there'll be a separate documentation site, and really trying to stay kind of low level and very friendly and approachable with this. I know a lot of people say this library is so easy to use, but I think what sort of lacks in that is other documentation, as well as just sort of a non-frills approach to as much of this as possible, with then getting into the more complicated stuff like Benford's law and other kinds of statsy things, which sort of leads me into what tests we're looking at. So right now, let me pull this up. So right now what we want to sort of look for is things like lat longs. If it's less than negative 180 degrees or more than 180 degrees, or it's 0, 0, that's not good. We want to see about country, county, state, and country names, or sorry, city country names. Are they spelled consistently? Extreme outliers in numerical columns, just sort of highlighting them. They could be a part of your story, and they could be really interesting and something you'd want to see, but just sort of making those aware that they exist. location has all expected sequential values. So this is basically if we see a column that's named state, or you have values within it that match up along lines of state abbreviations or state names, does it have all 50 of them? A lot of times when I was doing stuff with the Marshall Project, I'd get state by state prison data, and often there would be just no data for like North Carolina, and I was not thinking of North Carolina, and I'm able to throw it into D3, and then all of a sudden I see like this really black state there in my little choropleth, and I'm like, oh crap, like North Carolina just didn't, you know, submit data. And that's definitely something that, you know, we want to catch on the front end. Check if exactly there's 65,536 rows. It's a SQL error. If a number is a sum column, if it says sum, or we see that there is some sort of derivation there, that it is not 2,097,152, that's another summing SQL error. Or if a string is exactly 255 characters, duplicate rows, and column headers. So that's sort of the rough outline of stuff that we are looking at right now and writing tests for right now. After that, we will be sort of packaging it up and then working with a fellow named Ian Johnson, who built a lovely tool that allows you to fork and work on gists, and is really experienced with Node.js, and so he'll be helping us sort of build out more the front end of that side of things, and then we'll be coming back again, sort of in early spring, late fall, to do you know, another round of tests. So we want to sort of space this out and do tests all the way through with folks. So if you guys are interested in sort of helping out, taking some trying some beta tests, definitely get in touch with me afterwards. Cool.
Awesome.
Gerald, are you writing the data tests in Node as well, or are you using something else for that?
We're writing the data tests in Node right now. My background is Python, so right now we're seeing basically how fast can we sort of start working on the front-end side of things for the less technical people, and then definitely for folks like you and me, I think I'm really interested in also using some of this funding to free us up to do possibly like a Python version of this, as well as, you know, other different languages if folks are more comfortable in one language or another language.
Yeah. I mean, are there good Node packages that do this kind of stuff? Because I always thought that like the weakness of Node was that it does all this stuff very well, except for data science.
I think that's sort of, you know, we're focusing on right now is very much like checking if things are matching, and that sort of in and of itself needs to be couched properly and handled so you don't mix up types, of course, and so that is sort of the place that we're at right now. In terms of stats, though, I highly recommend Simple Statistics by Tom McWright. He did Mapbox, and he built out the fundamentals of, you know, having Unicode be representative of these like objects on a map, and sort of that's really the basis for it. So it's a really interesting approach for storing data and then representing that as a map. He also gets really geeky with stats and did a great, awesome Node library for this. Then the other sort of really good library that I like that we're going to be using is Michael Keller's Indian Ocean. Really, really great for reading and writing files too, and really great for scripts as well. So when I say no frills, I really mean sort of like trying to keep it simple with those things, not trying to get too fancy with buffers and winding people down a Node.js rabbit hole. I think, you know, ultimately we want to sort of keep this as literate as possible, and to a point that, you know, we have 6 months to work on this. If it needs to be you know, slower on writing actual tests, so they're more readable by humans, so be it. More programs are read by humans than they are by computers, and so we'd rather sort of have something that is definitely something that we can pass along, that you guys can use in your individual newsrooms or jobs, as well as rewrite or add to, or, you know, what have you. That's sort of the other beauty about this, is really having it be open source and allowing anyone to sort of make their own versions of it and have their reporters use it and create their own tests depending upon your own problems that you might see in Pittsburgh or San Francisco or where have you. I think, you know, one of the interesting things about data smells is that the longer you're in these positions, the more and more you know that this department is still using such and such database, and they often run into X, Y, and Z problem. And that is something that, a familiarity that I really hope that this can kind of solve and sort of help initiate that conversation to you know, the next gaggle of data journalists, whoever they might be.
I'm curious also about the decision to make it a standalone program, like a desktop program. I wonder, like, could some of this have been accomplished in plugins to something like I don't know, like Google Doc scripts or something? You know, I know it's kind of janky, but could you just talk about that a little bit?
No, actually, this is the first time that when I was putting this slideshow together, I was sort of, we've been doing some paper prototypes, and I did not have, you know, those readily on hand. But what I was sort of thinking about once I put that together was exactly what you said, was just sort of having that as be maybe a plug-in version. I think the ultimate sort of goal is that this sort of exists in modes that are most comfortable for whoever, for the user, and for having you know, people who are less familiar with this have more of a gateway into it, as well as then sort of providing an interesting few options, like I was saying, for Benford's Law, which is basically trying to see if there's an even distribution of the first digit of numbers, or if that even distribution sort of goes like, you see a lot of, you know, thousands and less 2,000s, 3,000s, 4,000s, 5,000s, that looks more like a naturally randomly generated data set than if you see one that's like all over the map. That might be like a faked data set, if you will. And that's definitely an interesting test that you can do, and it's just simple as counting up the first character. But also, it's definitely something that I don't want to, you know, throw at somebody if their data set is as simple as like 5 rows. And as well as, I think with the desktop app, going to what you were saying and answering your question way more directly, is that we, in talking tonight, their questions was how big, you know, how much data can this handle? And I am, you know, friends with Mike Tigas. I really liked what he did with Tabula. I like Google Refine, you know, was sort of my meat and potatoes when I was really starting, and I like that it sort of offloaded that problem of data size to your local computer. Another thing that we're sort of exploring with the SNITE funding is potentially having a hosted version for if you want to test it out or you want to do it yourself. But going back to sort of what I was initially saying, I think it's going to be a bit more of a suite, and definitely sort of enabling you to, if you're in Google Spreadsheets and, you know, your reporters are already comfortable with that, then sure, why not make it a script? Or if it's easier for them to work on a really, really big data set that they just FOIA'd and they get it in CDs, then have it be a desktop app.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Bueller.
I think that's like, so I really liked what you were saying about, you know, enabling this kind of like format so that other people can kind of like take it and go with it. So like, you know, bus factor. I'm always thinking bus factor, right? So like, I mean, and also, I don't know where y'all come from, but I came from a design background. Coding is kind of something that I was like, well, I can design the thing, why can't I build it? You know, so I just kind of learned by picking apart other people's code. So that's, I mean, it's so important to me to have something that's coded in a way that isn't like super clever or super frilly, or, you know, really helps you understand what's going on. And I'm sure that the Knight Foundation is also way behind that, you know, kind of enriching the minds of blah, blah, blah.
And I think like that kind of goes to, you know, sort of curious about to hear, your data stories. I think I come from a background that did a lot of web production work and taught myself coding along the way. Sometimes that meant throwing things into D3 maybe before I had fully learned R or pandas, or now I think Chris Groskopf also has a gate, or agate, which is really, really excellent too. But sometimes the design was also a stage for me, which I was using for analysis to begin with, and that was not maybe the best move. But I'm sort of curious about what your guys have noticed as problems, and this can be a very specific department that you work with, either locally or federally, or just in general, something that messed you up. I'm really sort of interested in hearing anecdotes, and please be specific, because I think that sort of is where we are looking to abstract out if that anecdote can be, become some kind of test. So, please go ahead.
So here's one. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here's one that's sort of it's sort of a bridge between the general and the specific, I guess. One thing that I thought might be interesting when you're describing some of the tests would be one question I have is sort of how configurable those might be, if at all. So, for example, with the latitudes and longitudes, I think it might be great if I could define sort of the area where I expect all of them to be in, and then if one is not, to let me know. And a similar thing might be numerical outliers. Let me specify how much of an outlier it should be before it gets highlighted, because of different different numbers will be distributed in different ways. So something may not be an outlier, may not be considered an outlier in one set of data, but would definitely be in another. And then for spellings, you could maybe even if I could specify here's a list, for example, and let me know if it's not spelled this way, something like maybe a list of state legislators or something like that. We've done some work with lobbying data in Missouri, and that's a big thing with that, because I don't know if those reports are typed or handwritten and transcribed or what, but you get all kinds of different spellings of organizations and things. So those were some things I thought about while you were describing the test. If they could be configurable, I think that would be a really awesome step.
Yeah.
Or if you could give it a list of this is what I expect in this data set. Like you mentioned states. You have 50 states. Maybe one's missing. I was thinking I might need to do that with all 87 counties in Minnesota soon. So if I could kind of have, through a lot of different data sets, be able to say, okay, I can instantly know which counties are missing in more than one data set.
Totally. I like that idea, and I think what we're sort of hoping to aim for with version 1, we're coming out with this in 6 months, is sort of with, we hope, actually something that you guys can use, is all of this stuff packaged in, and maybe some of it might be more optional or something like that. But with counties, I can include counties, or we can do some sort of special thing where it's I am in Missouri, I only want data relevant to Missouri.
Yep.
Or something like that.
Or if you could specify which counties.
Yeah, that would be really cool. Yeah.
Another with the latitude and longitude, something that I was geocoding misdemeanor arrests recently, and I had a horrible time because trying to figure out whether or not it was accurate, because I had to go through and hand check to see whether the different geocoding services I was using, was putting them in the right place. So if you mentioned making sure that they're in the pairs match, they make sure they make sense. I have no idea if I can barely program, but checking the address to the latitude and longitude and just making sure those match once you already have them.
Interesting. There's a couple, and I'm sure a few folks here have dealt with similar issues, but there's a couple of things that I see. It's problematic with that, which is like you always sort of have to figure out like what the coordinate reference system is. But there's some things that are also really, really interesting, which would be like if you can do some kind of spatial, like Natural Earth is this great big open source, lots of shape files of the Earth and cities and everything like that. Like if you did a spatial join and it's like you get a join back that gives you all kinds of like water body names, like that would also be kind of an interesting like red flag to check for or something. Yeah, I like that idea. That's cool.
Yeah, I can imagine that working really well even on a slightly simpler basis. Like, you know, like sometimes if I'm geocoding some really badly typed addresses, I know some of them are going to end up in the Indian Ocean or whatever, but I don't actually know that until I take that whole data set and like put it in like Google Tables or something or QGIS and then look at that, and then I have to go look at those IDs and go back to the data set and say these are the ones that are wrong. It'd be nice if they just, like I know they're going to be wrong, it'd be nice if they just kind of marked out like this is not in America or this is not the Western Hemisphere, something like that.
Yeah, expected like country or something.
Yeah.
Or addresses.
Yeah, like I don't need to know if it's if it matches up with the address. I just need to know if it's wildly out of line with what I was expecting.
Just like specify a bounding box or something like that, and then check to see if it's inside that bounding box. I think would be sufficient for something like that for me, for what I've used it for.
Yeah. I like the bounding box idea too because it sort of it removes the need for like more input forms and just sort of creates sort of a very simple like just create a box and you know is it in that box or is it not, and that data is sort of like lends itself more towards like let's say I'm getting something natural that doesn't meet administrative areas like cities and counties and countries like that, like the box is way more suitable for something like that. Yeah.
Or alternatively, I guess you could also say choose a point and then a radius, and that might be also not terribly difficult. You know, is everything within 200 miles of this point that I select on a map or something like that?
Yeah, I like that one. Yeah. Anyone else? Data. Dan, I know you have data problems. See you down there. So many.
I never know you could chat.
So I had actually a thing. I was wondering about like. So I recently worked on this big drug project, and outliers existed, but not in like. Okay, so imagine database. One column is like drug name, another column is dosage, and then another column is like quantity and then cost. So you know, 20 pills of Seroquel should cost around $100. So it's like using multiple columns to create, you know, do you know what I'm trying to say? To create something that would be like the standard deviation essentially. But like if I had like a column that was okay, Seroquel, you know, 30 pills for like $7,000, that would be an outlier. That cost column is going to have a lot of $7,000, $5,000, you know, dollar charges, but not for. It shouldn't be like that for that amount of Seroquel.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't, you know, thought about it like in that conjoined. Has anyone else sort of like run into similar like data like that is sort of within limits or I like the drug prescription idea though. That also applies to like a whole branch of like healthcare journalism, investigative healthcare journalism too, which is like just huge.
I mean, another way to kind of think of that or like conceptualize a solution, I guess, would be, you know, you want to subset your data before you sniff it out. So like, I don't know if there's any kind of like automate, you know, we tossed ours into Django and then created like query sets. So maybe that's an avenue where you're like, okay, well, how do you like what is your segment column? And if it's like drug name, then you know first it segments by drug name, and then it like analyzes all similar drug names for outliers or something like that.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. I think like that definitely. I need to talk to the other developer. The other thing about sort of this that we're sort of aiming for, I should sort of just say, is like, since it's like only 6 months, and we are kind of like, I think a lot of like with the JavaScript stuff is we're kind of also like trying to put these restrictions on ourselves, because we know that like there is already like Trifecta, which is trying to build some sort of like data proofing thing that's like a paid version. Obviously, Google Refine that we talked about, Django, all these things exist in the world, and so it's less about we're sort of like hoping to gain at the end of this is like not necessarily another database interface kind of thing or spreadsheet editor. It's more about like kind of allowing and offloading some of this traffic cop duty that I think a lot of different departments have sort of been tasked with, depending upon where you are, and really kind of putting that back in the hands of reporters and just sort of allowing it to sort of be like, oh, this is good, this is not good, and then, you know, if it's good, then let's go explore and everything, and let's sort of check it. And then that, you know, is it good is very basic. I do like that idea though of multi-joins and everything, and so I think like that's definitely going to be interesting. Like at the end of 6 months, like figuring out like where we want to go with this. You know, I think when we started, we were kind of also interested in like, could it be a recommendation system? Like I see you have states and counties. This could be made into a map, or I see you have time series data. This can be made into a line chart, but not a bar chart. So, you know, having these like little things that sort of give people indication as to what you can do with it, it was definitely one avenue that we discussed. But I think the other avenue that's also going to come into it is definitely like, can there be a more like user engaging analysis to it? I think the only thing that sort of puts it maybe outside the scope of 6 months is like the additional level of user testing and everything that would need to make sure that it does not become like an overwhelming thing that sort of is like, once you're talking about like multiple things, trying to like pack all of those options into menus and things like that, so new people to this data world understand that it gets to be its own task and everything.
Yeah.
But I do like that, and I've noted it down, and I'm not sort of, I like it a lot.
Oh, no, yeah, I mean, it could also be a way for, you know, you were talking earlier about collaboration and kind of like wanting that, and, you know, ideas maybe like that where it's like the number of people who actually have that problem are small. You could have users contribute, you know, like how-to docs essentially on like, okay, you know, this is like if you have this problem, like break your data down like this and then pass it through, and kind of creating like a workflow documentation for that sort, and then building up like on Write the Docs or whatever, building up a repository of stuff. Awesome.
Yeah, so we're going to be doing with we're doing documentation for the actual code stuff with JSDoc right now, or basically you write everything in as comments, and you specify arguments, variables, and what gets returned. So it's really nice way of breaking out like what goes into what goes out of, as they say, and then going from there. Looking at sort of getting 2 separate websites. I know you were asking about this, so we definitely want to have like one website where it's sort of like the discussion around this, because I think that's, you know, this ongoing discussion that's definitely, you know, was looking at old NICAR notes or SourceCon notes about this similar thing. I think somebody had a session called Data Linter, which they mentioned a lot of this stuff and possibly making something like that. But continuing really this conversation, because, you know, as data sets change and things break down in terms of what municipalities and states and countries have for databases, I think the problems are probably going to continue. So definitely we do want to also, there's going to be this like community aspect of this too, to sort of bring us all together and have this conversation about, you know, what are good data standards that we can all kind of think about, and not necessarily saying, like I was saying about the Boko Haram stuff, like that's ultimately where you're going to need human intelligence. But I think at the very least we can kind of start talking about, some sort of generic, almost like an AP style guide to this, like, you should check for X, Y, and Z. And this is sort of the nuts and bolts of, what makes good data journalism, and having ourselves sort of, having this checklist, I think, is a really, really helpful way of starting that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned time series, and that made me think that would also be nice to be able to see outliers in time series, because we've used crime data from crime reports, I guess, from the city here, and at the beginning of every month, there's always, or when they come out, they're sorted by date of occurrence, and there are always like 5 or 6 that happened years and years and years ago that somebody's just now reporting. And while, like you've said, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to throw those out of your data set. It's good to realize, like, hey, these things actually happened 10 years ago, and they're just now being reported. And then in our lobbying data that we've worked with, we've run into the same thing with like dates being transposed and things like that, where you'll get the month digits transposed, or even the year digits transposed, and so you have something that's like 50 years from now in the data, and clearly that's not correct, but that's what the data says. So yeah, I think that would be great to be able to see outliers in time series data too.
Yeah, I like your idea with the range input and everything. I think what we were sort of looking at is just doing a basic, going to Scott and sort of saying like the statsy way of going about this, just sort of like doing like a basic, does this meet in within so much deviation. For time series, I think that was definitely, getting into the nitty gritty of that. I'm sort of realizing there though that like that range input is way more helpful than trying to just sort of find out, like, I mean, unless you know of a way to statistically find, like, something without user input, like, any way of sort of saying, like, that's cool though.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe you could analyze the whole set and say, I don't know if there's a way to like tell, like, the majority of these fall within 1 year, but these, or one, like, look for where the majority of them are, and then find, like, you look for sort of standard deviation. But I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I don't know exactly how you do that with the time series thing. So the user
other
input
than
might be
epoch
the
time, maybe epoch time you could use for like differences between things, which is really, really fun, by the way, for folks on the line who it's a great way for converting actual dates to another format, and then you can then sort of translate it to pixel values and then put them on a div. So it's a cheap way of doing a timeline. Well, epoch time, EPOCH. It means that it's an arbitrary time, I think in 70 something or other. Brent, do you know the exact date? Yeah.
So around there somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a totally arbitrary date, but what that allows you to do is say that everything is X number of days after said event or said date or before, and because everything is in days, you can then add and subtract them from one another, get the differences, and that differences can then be scaled into your pixel values. But it's just generally good for like seeing like distances and times of parts and everything. 1970. There we go. Yeah. When the world was started in 1970.
Yeah, is that a date thing that you're checking for? Because I know early on in my like kind of development career, I was like, what the hell happened on December 31st, 1969, man? Like, what happened? Like, because I was getting, when it couldn't parse my data or whatever, it was just like serving me up like December 31st, 1969, and I was like, I just don't think.
I love that so much. Yeah, I think there needs to definitely be like some sort of weird like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference where it's like everything is just like 42, just like arbitrarily. I don't know. That's the other sort of thing we're jokingly talking about is like if Tabula can do poop emoji separated values, like can we throw in like a little funny thing too? Yeah, by the way, the latest version of Tabula does poop emoji separated values. It was supposed to be an April Fool's Day prank that just kind of got released in the last launch of it, so guys should definitely check that out. It's really, really funny. Is there any other? I'm kind of so we were talking about like geodata, time series data. I was sort of curious if there's anyone on the line who is particularly interested in stats, or if there's any kind of other like stats tests that they know of that are helpful for does this make sense, or is there any other kind of like generic data set categories that people could think about, like other than times or geodata?
This isn't practical, and you probably can't even do this, but I know that there is that, like the random distribution of numbers versus a human-created distribution of numbers.
Yeah, that's Benford's law. That's what I was saying.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let me find a quick link to it while I'm talking. Yeah.
Could you somehow just make this program do my job for me? That would be the best.
Yeah.
I just get to make it run in the background.
Let's see. There we go. There's a link to it, the wiki about it. But basically, what you're looking for is you want to see that the first digits of all of your numbers have a nice downward trending slope to it, and they match that what you would expect. And I think that that's true, but but I also, it also just seems like, really, that works? Like, I feel like somebody is going to get like some small data set or something or other, and like they're going to be like, well, it totally fails Benford's law, so I'm screwed, and then they like wind up like emailing me about what the fuck Benford's law is and like why is it like vomiting all over the place. So that's sorry to be crass about that, but
I think there's a website that you can go to where you can input a data set, and it will analyze it based on Benford's law, and it will let you know not only like what's the likelihood that it has been sort of faked, or what's the likelihood that it fails the test, but also it'll tell you like there's a significance level, and I'm pretty sure that's based on like how much data you have. So you could build it in to where if you've only got 10 numbers, then the confidence level is going to be pretty low. But if you've got 10,000 numbers, then the confidence level will be, a bit higher. There's probably also some like something to do with the actual test itself, like how much does it conform to that curve that it's expecting, would also determine the confidence level. But I think probably there's a way to do it based on how much data you're feeding it. Like, yeah, you wouldn't want somebody who gets who gets a list of 5 or 10 numbers that all begin with 1 to say, yep, this is fake. But you wouldn't, if you had 10,000, that would be a much more logical step to take. So.
Yeah, and I would say I don't see like I guess I'm not like envisioning like the user as like being somebody who's like, I have 5, like let me drop it in. But I think I'm sort of thinking about like 6 months from now, like all the little like like here's like me dragging and dropping a spreadsheet in. Like I guess like that's what I was thinking about, and then having Benford's law sort of be this big like thing that I'm like, okay, and here's this other thing I need to explain. But you're absolutely, I had not heard about that website, and I really like that idea of like having some kind of like significance or confidence just sort of meter or level to it, so that way you can kind of say like, oh hey, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Do you know the name of that website? Okay, there you go. Cool. Because I was thinking that's a good way of, if you have like bankruptcy filings, I'm sure courts do this, but seeing if the numbers provided make sense, because that should be in a large enough end that it wouldn't. It's not like 10 numbers, but.
I don't know. I would be interested. I mean, that's also like. I think the other thing that with Benford's law is I keep thinking about the amounts of like bankruptcies or something like that. Like, but if you're just looking at the first digit, it should be. Work. I honestly, I probably should just like play with it more and see like if I run into problems. But I'm interested if you guys, do you guys often use Benford's law? Has anyone finds themselves sort of having it in their basic suite of
the Radiolab episode about it is always in the back of my mind, but beyond that, no.
Radiolab did it. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, thank you. That's a really good note.
There was a financial investigator who uses Benford's law to testify in court about bankruptcy filings, or not bankruptcy filings, but like financial wrongdoings.
Oh, that is sweet. Okay, all right. You've just sort of like, it's like one for Benford's law. Then I hadn't used or I haven't heard of any cases other than like scientifically where people have been using Benford's law to prove or disprove like random distribution of a data set. But that's like that's a solid. Thank you for that. Thank you. This is really helpful.
Nice. So I had something to say. There was a conversation sparked on Slack the other day about you were talking about statistics and like sniffing out like problematic stuff there. Was it Chris Keller, I think, was asking about like, is it ever inappropriate to talk about the number of deaths as a rate by race? And we were kind of like, I brought that to our data reporter here, and we were kind of like, when would that, would that be a, and we were talking about like, well, if you you're dealing with population and you're trying to do rate, but your population, your like anyway, your bottom number is not big enough, then your whatever rate you calculate is gonna like look nuts, right? It's not gonna really be quality rate.
Yeah, something like I was trying to calculate the number of pipeline breaks per 100 miles for pipeline operators in California, and one ended up being something like 900 incidents per 100 miles, but it was because they only had 30 miles of pipeline. So it turns out that I was just trying to figure out a rate for a number that was way beyond what they actually operated with in California. I eventually stopped using that because it was completely throwing off what I was looking for.
Yeah, we just did a story too where we were looking at suspensions in Missouri schools by race, and we were calculating an index, sort of using the same formula that Missouri uses for traffic stops. So like to calculate a disparity between like looking at black students versus the entire population, and we were coming up like the highest one was like 9 point something, where like 1 would represent the rate that you would expect based on population in the school, and most of them were higher than 1 because black students tend to get suspended at a higher rate, but they were like 1, 2, 3, right around there, and then there were then the highest one was like 9 point something, and so I said, wait a minute, this seems high. So I went and looked at the data, and there were like 6 black students in the whole school. So when you get down to a population that's that low, then 1 or 2 have an outsized effect on that calculation that you're making. So yeah, I think that would be a great thing to look at. I wonder whether that, I don't know enough about the statistical tests that you'd be using to figure out like that might be caught in the in the outliers testing that you'd be that you've already got set up. So.
Yeah. I think this kind of goes back to, actually this is like one for what we were talking about earlier, and actually sort of allowing the user to link columns together and sort of say like one, depending upon this, like does this other thing make sense? Or possibly then just sort of like having that like input range of like, I expect percent change to, be a little high, but not on the like crazy high end of the spectrum. Like, that's also kind of like another interesting thing where it's like that. I think that's like partially editorial, right? It's like maybe there is something to be said about those places with like who are those 6 people and where did they go? Like that could lead to like a really, really awesome narrow story that like just doesn't even need data to tell. It's just like good journalism about like a handful of people. But then on the other sense, like when we want to do like a choropleth or something like that, then it's sort of you have to resort to interesting methods for binning. So if you do show that happens, and that sort of is like way out there and everything, and you acknowledge that that's happened, but like I'm kind of, what did you wind up doing in those cases where you guys had these like huge wild rates. Did you include it, exclude it, note it? You know, what did you go? How did you treat it?
So with that one, with the school suspensions one, what we wound up doing was we decided to eliminate all the schools where black students made up less than 5% of the population, because that way we said, here's how we calculated this rate, and in situations where the population is that low, you know, like I said, one or two students could have an outsized effect on this calculation that we're doing, so it's not really a valid way to look at, you know, the overall district. It was a school district, not building. But yeah, we wound up throwing out just throwing out the schools that were that low, and we noted that in the piece.
Yeah.
And then I think Keller did. They like mashed up or had side by side like the rate of deaths and then the rate of the of that like population in the general population. So that was kind of like a nice comparison.
Yeah, so even if it is crazy, you can see like, oh, that's because it's such a small population or something like that.
Right. I guess you kind of risk losing people there, though. People will be like, well, I don't get all this rate talk. I don't, you know.
Well, yeah, you either lose people or I feel like in those scenarios, and this comes with like bigger investigations too, it's like you gain people like your specific niche that you want to hit your audience, and then they're like, oh my god, this is crazy, and then it has a kind of, you hope that it has like with impact journalism like some kind of like ripple effect where like the scientists are like, oh my god, this is crazy, and then they can sort of, you know, say it in other ways. So, but anyway, sorry, Tyler, you popped on though. Did you?
Oh yeah. So I rolled in late, so I might be saying something stupid. But can you like implement like T-scores or Z-scores or that kind of thing too? It's kind of back on the statistical part, but yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of doing T-scores and Z-scores. We'd sort of not. I think that would be kind of like a version 2. We were sort of saying in the beginning. Was like Scott was asking about using Node for this. Scott Pham was on the line, and he was asking about using, you know, Node, and like, do you find that it would be good for statistics? And I was saying how, you know, what we're really looking for now is sort of like the basic kind of spell checking kind of stuff. Is there duplicate rows? Do you does the latitudes, longitudes make sense within some sort of range of values? And then kind of possibly using that like dummy sense of range for people, and then possibly coming in a second round, you know, or second version, and doing more of like the statsy side of it. I think that there's a lot of cool stats tools out there. Is sort of the brief way of saying this, and I don't think that you know, with a 6-month project I can sort of like produce something that's like the awesome stats package that's going to replace everything. Like Chris Grosskopf is doing really, really great work on Agate, and I think that that sort of, you know, is a great idea in and of itself. But where I sort of see this fitting in is very much like in that traffic cop scenario where lonely coders we have, you know, are the sole or next to only data-minded folk in the newsroom, and oftentimes we are also placed in the role of explaining why something, a story or something data set might not work to people who might not understand that, and to kind of sort of shift that into a more of a realm where that conversation can happen and they can visually see and, you know, have, as well as for us, like have all those tests just sort of be done, automated, and out the door, so you can kind of do some other stages in your. Did you all consider foreign language support? This is coming in from Dan in the chat. Yeah, actually, I'm really, really interested in that, and I'd love to talk to you about that, or anyone here about foreign language support and how that can work. Just because I don't have a huge budget to hire people to help, you know, make sure all translations are good. But I honestly am not as experienced in doing foreign language support. So, do you know of anything, Dan, in particular? It's like, I think error and warning messages will be, yeah, exactly, like translating them.
Oh, I thought you meant like checking the data if all the data is in Spanish. It's like Spanish numbers.
Yeah.
I used a Russian geocoder once, and I still have no idea if I was actually on point with that. But we're just going to assume that that was fine.
Russia uses a different geocoordinate system.
Well, yeah, well, the coordinates were the same, but the addresses were all like in a Cyrillic alphabet, and none of the geocoders that I've used before could understand it. So I had to go with, what is it, Yandex Maps or whatever?
Yeah.
That was a fun project.
Yeah, and totally, like that's sort of like what I'm on the same page as you, Dan. Like, and I'm sort of curious, like, if you know of anyone who'd be interested in with that, or organizations that we can kind of like, you know, work with for this kind of stuff. I'd really be interested in talking about that, because definitely lots of really great data journalists are, you know, working around the world and everything. Yeah.
I think Reveal just hired a Spanish language producer because they've been doing a lot of stuff with bilingual reporting.
Yeah, I went to University of Texas at Austin, and they have a really great night lab. So I might reach out to them to see if they might be able to lend a hand with some of this stuff. But yeah, that's definitely a really, really good idea. Thank you, Dan. Yeah.
Awesome.
Anyone else? Oh.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
We're hitting an hour here.
Cool.
This was so good, though. I don't know. I feel like people brought a lot of good stuff. I was so curious to hear. Like, I knew a little bit about Dataproofer, but then I was like, what are these tests? So it was just like kept me up at night.
Well, I'm glad that I've taken away or sort of revealed some of this mystery and sort of where we're coming at with this. Like I said, definitely I'll hit you guys up on Slack, or hit me up on Slack if you're interested in being involved in any way. Dan, definitely let me know if you want to talk about translating for Spanish, because that is actually probably be my first choice to do, like multilingual support would be Spanish notifications as well. You guys, it's been really great talking to you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the Slack rooms. Thank you so much for putting this together. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank y'all for showing up. Good one.
All right.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
See y'all around.